Hello and welcome everyone to Module 4. It's great to have all of you with me again. This module is going to be exciting because we are finally going to get to move beyond the creation stories. We have spent one module on our general overview of Genesis and our introduction to the course, and then two modules on the creation stories in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. So today we're going to be moving into the primeval history that comes beyond the creation stories as we take a look at chapters 3 through 11. There are going to be two lectures presented with this module. In this first lecture, I'm primarily going to be wrapping up our study of the creation stories, and then in the next lecture I'm going to talk about some of the things that take place in chapter 3 through 11, and we're going to be looking at some of the patterns that are evident there. Please pray with me. O God, we praise you and glorify your name today. Thank you for everything that you have shown us through our study of the stories of creation. Thank you for all the ways in which our beautiful world demonstrates your handiwork. And thank you for creating us in your image to have dominion over your creation. We ask that as we represent you to the world, we would care for all your creation as we look forward to the final redemption of the world through your Son, Jesus Christ. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, in this first lecture, as we wrap up some of the things we talked about in terms of the creation stories, I'd like to do two things. First of all, I would like to say some things about the relationship between Genesis and ancient Near Eastern literature, some of which you had the chance to read, and I'll try to summarize some of the things that you identified in the discussion board and in your assignments about the relationship between these two. And then secondly, I'd like to say a few more things by way of summary pertaining to Genesis 1 to 2, especially from a theological and a literary perspective. What are some of the things that these two chapters working together can say? So first of all then, to talk a little bit about Genesis and some of the ancient Near Eastern literature. Let's start with summarizing a few of the similarities between the Old Testament and the Enuma Elish as you discovered. Some of you pointed out, first of all, that both stories, that is the Enuma Elish and the biblical story, start with a situation of disorder and chaos. In Genesis 1, we see that this is present through the Tehom, or the deep as it's described, that existed before God began his creative work. In the Enuma Elish, of course, that chaos is present through Tiamat and is represented by her. As we will talk about in just a minute, that chaos and disorder are dealt with completely differently by the two stories, but nevertheless, the writers of both assume that it had to be dealt with before the universe could create it, and probably both writers in their worlds assumed that to some extent it was still out there beyond the creation and the earth as we know it. Secondly, both Genesis and the Enuma Elish narrate the creation of the heavenly bodies and describe how those heavenly bodies help keep track of the calendar and mark the passage of time and divide one period of time from the other. We said that in Genesis 1 this would have been especially important to the priests that probably put the story together, because they were the ones who were in charge of, who presided over all of the festivals that were based on that calendar. That may have been the case with the writers of the ancient Near Eastern myth or the copyists, although of course we don't know. But nevertheless, the heavenly bodies were very important for marking time and marking especially significant religious periods of time in both cultures. Finally, we saw that both stories are going to describe the separation of the heavens and the earth. In Genesis, that took place through the creation of the dome, which holds the waters of chaos back, and that's how we saw that the creation of the atmosphere was possible, so to speak. And in the Enuma Elish, the heavens and the earth were separated when Marduk split Tiamat's carcass in half after his fight with her. Most of you, however, thought that there were more differences than similarities between these two stories, and so let's talk about those for a few minutes. One of the most obvious differences that many of you pointed to was the polytheism of the ancient Near Eastern accounts. In the Enuma Elish, there are all kinds of gods, and they are all fighting and struggling against one another. And what's also interesting about ancient Near Eastern mythology in general is that they all have stories about the times when their gods came into existence. In other words, the gods had to be created or born, and usually they were born through the union of two other deities. Of course, in the Old Testament, that's not at all the case, and in Genesis we have no description of at all of any time when God would have had to come into being. God is simply the all-powerful creator. And the way it's shown that God is the all-powerful creator is that in the Old Testament we don't have any struggle behind this creation as we do in the Enuma Elish. In the ancient Near East, they understood that creation came about through something called a chaos Kampf, which is the German word for struggle against chaos. And of course that chaos Kampf is represented by the battle between Marduk and Tiamat. Although there is chaos that has to be dealt with in Genesis 1 as well, there is never any Kampf, there is never any struggle against that chaos. God does not have to fight against another deity. God does not have to fight against any sea monsters or anything like that. Rather, God is simply able to create the world peacefully, simply by the power of his own word. And then finally we saw that humans have different purposes in both of these accounts of creation. In the Enuma Elish, we saw that humans were created primarily to carry out mundane tasks for the gods, so they could spend more of their time sitting back and relaxing. This is a far cry, of course, from Genesis, where human beings are created to till and to take care of the earth, when they are created as God's image to represent God in the world, to rule over creation on God's behalf. So certainly a very different position for humans in each of these two stories. So now that we have taken a look at some of the differences and similarities, let's go on and talk on a broader level about the relationship between the Bible and ancient Near Eastern literature in general. A lot of these stories that we are reading, which would have been written either in Sumerian or Akkadian, were discovered in the 19th century, and that was kind of the heyday of discovering and deciphering all of these writings. In 1902, a scholar by the name of Friedrich Delitzsch caused really kind of a storm when he delivered his infamous Babel Bibel lecture, in which he sharply criticized the Old Testament and said that it was simply another representation of ancient Near Eastern mythology, that the creation stories and the flood stories were simply a rewriting of the myths that we have already been reading. As we said, that caused kind of a storm, but to some extent that's a controversy that continued for many years. A controversy kind of between the secularists, so to speak, who saw things as Delitzsch did, and sort of the very committed and traditionalist Christians who referred to their opponents as godless heretics, and to some extent may have tried to argue strongly for seeing the differences between the Bible and the ancient Near Eastern materials. I think that today finally we have reached more of a balance in how to take a look at the relationship between the two, so to speak. We have begun to recognize that neither should be subordinated to the other. In other words, let's not say that the Bible is just a recopying of the ancient literature, nor should it be the other way around. Rather, we have come to see that the primary purpose of comparative studies is to learn about how ancient people thought about themselves and about their world. So we're not trying to compare the merits of different cultures and viewpoints, nor especially to establish the direction of borrowing. That means as Christians, we certainly don't need to assume that the Bible was simply a copy of the ancient Near Eastern stories as people like Delitzsch did. Rather, the ancient Near Eastern stories just kind of help us understand the background in which, against which the biblical writers were composing their materials. Dr. Arnold, as you have seen in your commentary, I think gets it exactly right, where he says that Genesis and the ancient Near Eastern creation stories draw from a set of common cultural themes. He says that the writer of Genesis, for instance, probably didn't even directly know the Enuma Elish in the form that we have it. Rather, he simply knew about some of those themes, made use of those in some of his stories, and probably even tried to respond to and rebut some of those themes in other parts of his writing. Now, your textbook by Sarna, the commentary by Sarna that we're using, tends to emphasize the differences between Genesis and the ancient Near East. He puts more emphasis on Genesis 1 as a polemic against these ancient Near Eastern writings. I like his book very much because I like sort of the way in which he draws the distinction and shows us that some of these cultural assumptions that we see in the ancient Near Eastern material would have been known by the Genesis writer, but that the Genesis writer was trying to react against them and show how the God who created the world of Genesis was significantly different. A lot of you have talked about that in your assignments and your discussion sheets, and I appreciate your efforts to do that. Okay, and finally, let me just offer a few concluding points about Genesis 1 to 2 from kind of a theological and literary perspective. A lot of these go back to Dennis Olson, who teaches at Princeton Theological Seminary, largely on the Pentateuch. As we look at these two passages and these two stories, let's ask, what are some ways in which they say the same thing in different ways? How do the creation story of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 say the same thing in different ways? Well, first of all, of course, as many of you noted in your discussion board, they emphasize that God created everything. And so there's no question about that in either one of the stories. Secondly, Genesis 1 and 2 are both going to indicate that humans are stewards of creation. In Genesis chapter 1, that is especially shown when God says that human beings are to have dominion over the rest of the earth. They are supposed to be created in His image, and as such they represent God to the rest of creation and rule over the rest of creation, kind of in the same way that an ancient Near Eastern king would have ruled, would have set up a statue or an image of himself to rule over the nations he had conquered. In the case of the world, God sets up humans as His image to help rule the world that He has created. And then Genesis 2 shows humans as stewards of creation by emphasizing that God created them to keep and to till the garden, and by giving the man a role in the creative process, so to speak, by naming the animals. Third, both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 affirm that there are ties between human beings and creation. In Genesis 1, for instance, human beings share the sixth day of creation with the animals. Both on day 3 and on day 6 there are two creative acts. And so on the sixth day, the first creative act is the creation of the animals, and then the creation of the humans. In chapter 2 of Genesis, the Yahwist story, this connection between humans and creation is demonstrated especially in that the man is created from the dust of the earth. There is always going to be this relationship between humankind and the earth, and we will talk about that more in the next lecture as we look at the rest of the primeval history. But in the fourth case, both of the creation stories in the Bible emphasize human ties with God. In the first story, that's especially evident in the fact that the human beings are created in God's image. There is some characteristic of God that is in them. There is some similarity to God that no other creature or part of God's creation happens. In the second story, that connection between God and human beings is represented by having God breathe life into the human that he has formed out of the dust of the earth. It is also, again, shown by man helping to name the animals. That also shows some connection between God and human beings. But finally, we could also say that the Genesis creation accounts say something new together. And if we had only one or the other, even our Christian theology today would be much the poorer for it. And one thing that these two stories say together is that God is both transcendent and immanent. In the first story, we have a representation of God's transcendence. God looks at the universe he has created, or God creates the universe almost as if he is looking at it from a distance, we might say. That is kind of the picture we get in Genesis 1. God just speaks things into existence, from the seas and the earth to the stars and the planets. In the second story, on the other hand, God is more immanent. God gets his hands down in the dust of the earth, so to speak, and creates the man out of the dust. God tells the man things. God seems to speak to the man. And in the continuation of the Garden of Eden story that we will see in chapter 3, God is going to come walking in the garden and looking for them. So very much a representation of God's immanence. That's why both of these stories are important and necessary. If we had only the first story, we would understand a lot about God's transcendence, but much less about God's immanence. And a God without immanence is a God that is hard to worship. On the other hand, if we had the second story only, we would know a lot about God's immanence, but not about God's transcendence, which is what emphasizes God's might and God's power and God's strength. Okay, so I'd like to thank you again for your good work on looking at these creation stories, at looking at some of the materials we have from the ancient Near East, and at attempting as much as you can to learn as much from these as you can. You have prepared yourself well for a study of the rest of Genesis, and indeed for a continued lifelong study of the rest of the Bible.